I was messing around doing a little bit of doodling last night of what I thought the entrance to the underground bunker for my characters in my book, The Resistance Girls, might actually look like. And it was just for fun. But actually the sketch is beginning to work. You can see there's lots of lines here where I've done lots of rubbings out for lines that didn't quite work and added new ones in. And I'd quite like to work this up into a little watercolour painting, just to pass the time really, to have a little bit of fun. And the process of turning a sketch into a watercolour is quite an interesting one. So the first thing to do, in fact, is to take a trace of the lines here that work and then transfer that onto watercolour paper. So this is the trace that I've done. You can see that I've actually altered it a little bit. I've altered the ladder down from the hatchway, and I've cleaned up a lot of the lines on the actual storage area here. And what I'm going to do is add these lines onto a thicker piece of watercolour paper rather than sketch paper. So if I go in close there, you can see that is the rough outline of the elements that I think work. Now what I'm going to do now is get out my watercolour pencils, and I'm going to pick out the lines in the right colours using just a very, very light watercolour pencil before I then add in the layers of colours. So that makes it stand out a little bit better, and you can see pretty much where I'm going with this. But now it's time to put some layers of watercolour paint on. I'm just going to run a very light rubber over the whole area to remove any of the graphite pencil. But I'm being really, really careful and very, very light so that I don't bruise the watercolour paper, because that will unfortunately interrupt the way that any watercolour paint interacts with the paper. So because this is World War II and we're going for a sort of a camouflage underground hidden feel, I'm going to be working with browns and a little bit of green. So I've got a selection here of some really rather lovely colours. I've got a lovely yellow ochre there, and what's that one? That's a raw sienna. I'm going to be working with burnt umber, and no, that's a raw umber, and that's a burnt umber. Over here I've got sepia, which is gorgeous. And a Van Dyke brown, and of course I have got an ivory black as well. So I'm going to be working, as I usually do, with light layers of sort of weak tea type watercolour paints, and then going on with darker layers. And the whole sequence can be used for any drawing. Obviously I'm not expecting other people to be wanting to draw World War II bunkers, but this is the sequence of paints going on that are the key to the success with any of these sorts of paintings. Okay. Raw umber is a very good one to start with. Now I'm going to be thinking of light. Obviously it's underground, so it would be very dark, but I can't paint it all black. So I'm going to be assuming that the light is coming in through this open hatchway, and giving me a little bit of light that I can work with. So the lighter bits of wood will be on this side of this shelving unit. And then I should be working shadows into the other sides. My lovely husband's just wandered past and said, what on earth are you painting that for? which is a frequent response that I get from him, bless him, but he genuinely wanted to know. And I was able to explain that I am giving a talk on the Resistance Girls in a few weeks' time, and it would be quite nice to have some pictures to put on the slides. And rather than use stock stuff from the internet, I thought a few pictures of how I think these underground bunkers worked would be quite nice. just using the very tip of this brush. It is a size 7. I could have worked with a smaller brush, but I quite like this one because it's holding quite a nice amount of paint. Just for the first layers here. All right, something stronger for the sides. All right, obviously the initial down bits are dry, so I can go in quite confidently with the darker paint on the sides here. These timbers are supposed to be very rough and ready. They've been thrown together in a hurry in wartime, so they don't have to be beautifully smooth or constructed terribly well, which is useful because my drawing is a little bit random. I always love these things. Once colour goes on the page, it starts to pop, which is really rather nice. But I am being very careful to paint all of the various sections individually, as if they've been constructed in those parts, as it has been, mainly because what I don't want is the paint to sort of just run into each other and just look like I've just covered the whole thing all at once in one go. So taking each section of the shelving unit and treating it individually. Okay, I'm going to move that around. Don't forget, you can always move your paper around if it makes it easier to get to bits, because the angle that you're painting from can be just as important as the paint that you're putting on. Turning it upside down now. I want to be able to get to the underside of the shelves. This one at the top in particular, and make that much darker than the others. Again, using just the very tip of the brush and not pushing down terribly hard. Great for brush control, this. There we go. Okay, not sure how much we can see of the underside of any of the other shelves, but maybe just a little bit of that one. Okay, coming back to the right way up. Okay. This is the ladder that they're using to come down into the bunker. Again, I'm going to turn the painting again, just to make sure that I can get a decent angle and a relatively straight line on this section. So this is the ladder that the girls in the Resistance are using to get down into the bunker. Again, I'm going to paint these sections individually so that they don't all run into each other, because it's a blinking nuisance when paint does that. It's quite nice to have the sections distinct, and it helps to give the structure. So I'll start with just that side of the ladder. Tidy it up a little bit down there. Okay, and do something similar for this one. Okay, so the actual rungs of the ladder would be darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. So I'm going to turn it around again. It's one of the best tools in painting, actually, is the ability to turn your painting around. I'm going a little bit closer there so that you can see. I'm going to start putting the rungs in now that the other bits of paint are dry. Just going to do the bottom section of the rung to start with. Leaving the top lighter. Okay. Again, it's a little rough and ready, this one. This equipment would have been thrown together in a hurry with not very many resources. But the light from the hatch, the open hatchway, would come down onto the top of the rungs. Okay, so I'm going to spin that back round the right way up. And I think that looks quite effective. Okay, now I'm going to think about my boxes. So with the boxes, I'm going to do a variety of different browns because they wouldn't all be the same shade on the shelf, but I'm going to work again with the lighter sides on this side and the darker sides on that one. So I'm just going to have a different mix of browns. This one is my raw sienna, I think this one is. And of course this is the front side of the box, so I'm not necessarily going to paint them all in solid colours, leave little bits of white on them, just because that makes it more effective really. They might also be quite bashed boxes. We don't know what they had stored in them. But with these underground bunkers, very often this storage chamber at the front was part of the deception. It was designed so that if it got discovered, the enemy troops would assume that that's all that there was there. However, behind the shelving systems very often were the entrances to the actual secret bunkers where the girls were actually living in quite cramped, dark, damp conditions. But things would be stored on here like weaponry and caches of vegetables, food and vegetables, and also things like blankets and general supplies really, so that the enemy might be fooled into thinking that they'd stumbled across sort of maybe a black market cache or hidden weapons from a local militia potentially, but not actually investigate too much further. Now I want to do a little bit of this outside before I continue to work on any of the inside. So I've mixed up a mix of burnt umber and raw umber, just to have yet another shade of brown. I'm going to run it around this part of the painting, just beneath where I'm going to start putting the grass in, I think. So it's quite a big area, so I want to keep it moving so it doesn't get too patchy. Although that might happen. Whenever I'm painting large areas, I do tend to end up with it getting patchy. And I get a bit cross with myself because I think I should have managed to get an even layer of colour, but quite frankly, it's watercolour. It's virtually impossible to get really even colours with watercolours. And actually that's half of the beauty of them really, that you kind of get this little patchy sort of feel. Okay, so the next stage is I'm going to be doing a little grass along the top here. So let's just go in a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. And I've mixed up some of my sap green, which, as you know, is one of my favourites if you've ever seen any of my other videos. And I'm just going to be putting a little bit of grass along the top here. A lot of these bunkers were very carefully camouflaged. And in fact, I'm going to be putting some grass along the top of my open hatchway, so that when it was closed you wouldn't necessarily be able to see it. There would be other things camouflaging it as well, obviously. They tended to put them in areas of really quite dense foliage. It might be a prickly bush, might be behind a fallen tree. Something that wouldn't, for example, in the winter be more exposed. So it would be a perennial bush of some sort, something prickly, hopefully, to deter people to get too close to it. I think the next thing to do is my hatch. So I'm just going to turn it and zoom in so you can see what I'm doing again. And I'm going to be doing this in layers of sepia that kind of work with the metal of the steps going down. So just put an initial, again a weak tea layer on, and I can work with work shadows into later. And again, not doing a full solid bit of colour, leaving a little bit of white there. Distinct sections, always good. I think these hatches were really quite heavy, so quite tough for them to... Just bringing in a vague suggestion of that back wall. Again, with a very light touch of this sepia, very, very sort of wet version of it. And again, it's just a suggestion as I pull it down the back there. Not being too careful, very sort of rough and ready. I think that there would be lots of sort of random shadows on this back wall. There we go. It needed a bit of colour just to make it suggest that it was actually there. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to think about is maybe a little bit of greenery up the top here. A few bushes perhaps that might be used for camouflage. But realistically, I don't want to put too much here that's going to draw the eye from the rest of the painting. So it's just going to be a little suggestion of vegetation along the top here. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'll go in with a darker layer in a little while just to add a little bit more to that. And then I'm coming back into my main body of the painting here, and I'm just going to darken some of the more shaded sides just to make them pop a little bit more. And I think a little bit of patchy blue sky over the top of the vegetation. Nothing too exciting or dramatic, just a suggestion that there's a bit of sky up there. Something that maybe the girls missed when they were underground, monitoring their radios. So while this section's drying, I'm going to put a heavier shadow behind the shelving there. Nothing too strong, but just a little stronger than we've got. Now back to the bushes. Adding in a darker green, I think, just for a little bit of texture in there. It's possibly a little bright, that one. I'm going to lift some of that out. We just want a little bit of shadow in there. And possibly a slightly different tone to the grass. Also, I'm going to put a few shadows on this wall, just under there maybe. The steps as we come down. And to add a little more detail to the hatch. Just going to add the definition of the grass along here. Again with a concentrated form of the original sap green. Just picking out the grass, making it stand out over the vegetation that I've popped in behind. Perhaps we'll have some of it longer than others, so that it doesn't look like somebody's freshly manicured lawn. After all, these would be in somewhat wild places, maybe the forest like in the book. Not necessarily in somebody's back garden. Just using the very tip of the brush. So that's the main painting finished. I will probably fiddle with it a little bit more, with adding a little bit more depth, with shadows in various places, but I'm just going to sign the bottom quickly and leave it there. I've really enjoyed that. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. And I'll leave you there till the next time.